All right, I'm going to finish a little bit of there's only 2 pages left from Michael Arron Kamins' preface to this book, Hypermodernity and the End of the World. Let's see here. All right, so feel free to check out part 1 as my last video for the first couple of paragraphs. Here we go. If hypermodernity is an integral reality with no more distinctions between the real and imaginary, then why hasn't the world fallen back to the pre-modern hybrid reality? Or just disappeared into a plane of consistency as into the Gnostic pleroma? Or returned to the pre-cosmogonic chaos prior to the separation of the world parents, Mother Earth, Father Sky, real imaginary? It is because hypermodernity implies technical mediation, which maintains modular, market-drawn distinctions between things. There's a question, actually. Is it because hypermodernity implies technical mediation, which maintains quote-unquote modular, market-drawn distinctions between things? In other words, capital speculation draws and redraws the lines between things, delineating them into planes of organization and according to the dictates of the global economy. As our authors discuss, the quote-unquote modularity of hypermodernism is IKEA-like topography of quote-unquote de-worlded entities. What they've called quote-unquote digital capitalism seeks to work like Empedocles' strife and love. It makes everything one, love, the same class of harmonious thing, a modulable, monetizable, denuded of mass via digitalization, so it can flow smoothly with light speed, circulatings through the hollow earth. And yet the ever-shifting cutting edge of demand and innovation keeps things jostling, maintaining planes of organization, shifting things through new iterations, ever new modulations of beings in the digital clearing of the vert. Everything is captured up into technical modules of capital kept in global circulation, like an electromagnetic hurricane. And that's why everything hasn't already disappeared, to paraphrase the title of one of Baudrillard's books. But what I've only broached here in highly speculative form is the enterprise and question of this book by Culkin and Ebert. Yes, why not, or precisely, the end of the world. This semiotic excess, the hyper, is really the fate of the Newman today. There is a history of the hyper. It was the magic potency of things for our foraging ancestors. It was the intelligence and value of things conveyed in the myths of the planting peoples and religions of the high civilizations. And later it became the being, quote-unquote being, of philosophy and the question of quote-unquote meaning. It flowed through meridians and geomantic ley lines. It shone as the halo of saints. In antiquity it spoke to poets, oracles, and prophets. Logos of Philo of Judea. In the medieval era, it was locked up in the heavens and was the ether that turned the spheres. In the modern era, it was brought down from above, but was dislocated into the future, to be reached by the venture capital of progress. Today, after the future, the hyper is the nowhere. It's the bleed-through effect of what I call C3GI or CGI cubed, the capital climatic global imaginary, aka the hypercloud. The Earth has been encased in a digital etheric sphere of electromagnetic signals that form both a matrix for the radical actualization of the imagination and a kind of neuro-gnostic prison for the psyche. C3GI, a vert integration of the Internet of Things that folds the reals together. Your private unspoken thoughts show up moments later and before as recommendations from Amazon, Google, etc. Ads infinitum. Quote, "You look absolutely beautiful. You truly belong here with us among the clouds in the retro future. Welcome to Lanulos. Ride a connectome laser." It's from in the archives the 30 Ethers. A couple more pages here. The beats mapped at 100 miles per hour, the post-World War II American infrastructure of interstate highways in the twilight of the old railroad earth, while military electronics were rapidly disseminated into both a new media and pharmacological horizon, the Twilight Zone tunnels of the 1960s TV and LSD. That new mediality mutated rapidly and exponentially so that in the 1970s, many intelligent people could not imagine more than a quarter century left of history till the coming of one or another apocalypse, e.g. Y2K, the AI singularity, or the end of the Mayan calendar, December 2012. It is perhaps significant that some of the first specific texts on hypermodernity appeared in 2013, with John David Ebert's aptly titled Art After Metaphysics, followed by my own poetry cycle, Absences, and a steady succession of books by Brian Francis Culkin, and the writings and artworks of others, notably the art of American Southerner Mary Church and the UK digital art of Chris Boyd, and recently the meme trickery of Ikyu Sojun. According to this register, hypermodernity is simply a literary movement branded by a small but international circle of writers and artists addressing the transformations of our being in the world since the internet went public in 1995. And that is no minor task, for those transformations were anything but minor. They were instantiations of an alchemic paradox, the simultaneous dissolution and apotheosis of the modern horizon. Between Hiroshima and 9/11, that horizon was vaporized and, like digital sublimate, resynthesized in the clouds. But these transformations, or hypermodernity, are only the latest iterations, if not also final and absolutization of an old story of progressive eschatology. From Joachim of Fiore's Age of the Holy Spirit and Gerhard Dorn's Onus Mundi to AOL and Microsoft Azure, we are all floating now in the sky blue cilium of the Faustian alchemic imagination in the clouds. And the hypermoderns are really all of you reading this book, a book which will finally give some directions, if not yet to any destinations, that at least to the landmarks and signposts of the way. For all of us hypers are mapping at light speed the information superhighways of an entire Gnostic electronic globe, through the hollow earth and into the twilight of places, including the stubborn mentality of the Gutenberg galaxy that imploded into cyberspace by 1995, and since the cloud, iCloud 2011, has been unfurling into the dream space of the hyper. You can follow Culkin and Ebert further down the rabbit hole towards the end of the world into the ecstasy of evaporation if you dare. But in many ways you already have. Now it's time to wise up about it. Learn where you are. Just how far out are you in the new aeon since the curtains closed on the moderns? Since the appearance of the Tic-Tac UFO and the Clockwork Elves? Sail along with Little Baron Trump in his boat of gigantic tortoiseshell. Take the Pegasus Bridge. Carry the barrel, unless you want to remain in the water asleep with the fishes. That was the preface, March 23rd, 2019. All right, I'm going to read a little bit of Chapter 1, the introduction on hypermodernity. I think this is the Chapter 1, or is it just an introduction? Yep, introduction on hypermodernity. It is a few pages. Maybe I'll get through a little bit here. Every world age comes into being out of a catastrophe. The great geological epochs, i.e. the Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, and so forth, all came into being out of the liquefaction and melting down of the biogeological forms of a previous world age. The same can be said of human culture epochs, cultural epochs as well. Hence, World War II was the great event that separated modernity from postmodernity, irrevocably dividing one world age from the next. Everything that we think of as quote-unquote postmodern came into being after it. i.e. eclecticism in architecture, the death of the meta-narrative, Lyotard, the rise of minority cultures, decolonization and the voice of the cultural other being expressed in academic, etc., etc. Likewise, the event that separates modernity, properly speaking, demarcating it, say, from the Enlightenment, from all that went before it, was the French Revolution and the succeeding Napoleonic Wars that eventually, once the dust had settled, led to the Haussmannization of Paris, a complete structural reworking of boulevards, streets, and demolition of old, worn-out neighborhoods that was already consistent with the revolutionary tendency toward deconstruction, that is to say, of the getting rid of old grand historical meta-narratives. Hence the advent of the metric system, the attempt to implement a new world calendar by getting rid of months and days named after old European gods and goddesses, intertwined with Christian eschatologies. The difference in world horizons is exemplified by comparing Inger's 1827 painting, The Apotheosis of Homer, with Manet's 1862, Le Déjeuner sur l'Herbe. Sorry, you can hear my daughter in the background. Whereas the former painting apotheosizes the West's grand Homeric narrative of descent from the classical world, Manet's painting absolutely deifies all attempts at trying to find a narrative in it. After the restructurings of Haussmann and Napoleon III, the French Impressionist painters put Paris on the map as the capital, not only of the 19th century, to quote Walter Benjamin, but of the entire project of modernity down to World War II, after which the center of the art world shifts with abstract expressionism to New York, although Paris becomes the intellectual capital of postmodernity in the 1960s. Such eventual shifts between world ages can be found all throughout history, for they are not all unique to Western modernity or even geology. The 17th century BC, for instance, was an age of horizontal demarcation with the advent of the two-wheeled horse chariot and compound bow that, in the West, created the Mycenaeans of the Peloponnese. Troy level 6, 1700 BC to 1200 BC, and the Hyksos invasion of Egypt, which was ruled for a little over a century by Semitic peoples from Palestine. The Hyksos dynasty ended in the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, and their expulsion from Egypt by the twin brothers Amos and Kamos around 1530 BC marked the transition of Egypt into its new kingdom imperial phase and the creation of its trans-Palestinian empire. Another such event takes place around the year 1200 BC, which brings this late Bronze Age of chariot empires to a close with a massive systems collapse signaled by the Trojan War and the eruption from the Black Sea of marauding sea peoples who systematically dismantle and destroy the Mycenaean world, the Hittite Empire, and nearly all of the cities of Palestine. Egypt barely survives this period intact, but its imperial days from that point were over. Not to digress too far, but I think it's important to understand that such world ages are nothing new and indeed make up the ontology of both the biogeological as well as the human cultural history, which is catastrophe and discontinuous, as Cuvier had always insisted. The great event, likewise, that signifies the decisive shift from postmodernity to hypermodernity was September 11, 2001. Up until then, as Baudrillard liked to point out, events had been on strike and had apparently ceased to happen. As globalization dissolved history into its anticlimactic end, but 9/11 was the great Hyksos event that signified the transition of American political power from the concerns of what Carl Schmitt called its grossarium, that is to say, its transnational hemispheric domain, to the building of an imperial security state apparatus with a global external proletariat defining a specific outside in the form of those neo-Hyksos barbarians known as the Mujahideen and their various genealogical offshoots, ISIL, ISIS, etc. At least this is the event that signaled the shift on the political plane. For on the technological plane, the shift can be more precisely demarcated to the year 1995, when the National Science Foundation turned the internet over to the public. The impact of the internet on all previous forms of media is the equivalent of, on the technological plane, of the Ixos event of 9/11 on the political plane. For the internet now proceeded to provide hypermodernity with its world interior, which had earlier been architecturally expressed in the 1851 event of the Crystal Palace in the Great Exhibition in London of that year, preceded by the Parisian prologue of the arcades of the 1830s, which provided modernity with its world interior, namely that of a global shopping mall. This was a kind of a translucifying of retail space, an opening up of it, as it were, by liquidating its walls and rendering them transparent to the outside. As Walter Benjamin pointed out, the department store came into being out of the Parisian arcades, as well as the concept of retail stores connected by labyrinthian alleyways with iron and glass enclosures. Whereas the Crystal Palace simply enclosed all retail space into a single, gigantic, linear open mall lined with purveyors and merchants, the ultimate outcome of that phase of modernity marked by the discovery and conquest of the New World and the expansion of Western imperialism across the planet, from whence signifiers of all kinds and sorts were ripped from their various cultural contexts and put into the circulation of industrial capitalism. Whereas the world interior retail space of postmodernity was the advent in Edina, Minnesota in 1956 of the shopping mall, which introduced the innovation of turning all the retail spaces away from the city center and face them, as it were, with their backs, while enclosing itself in a bi-level air-conditioned interior as a miniature city. The shopping mall, with its fake plants, strategically placed fountains, and above all its electrified staircases in the form of escalators, became the world interior of postmodernity. And along with it, quote-unquote, the non-place, that is to say, the eruption during the 1950s in America of the interstate highway system and its various motels, fast food restaurants, and strip malls, all of which had a decentralizing effect on the quaint old city center of the traditional modern city. While the downtown areas began to crumble, the city exported itself to the countryside so that, as McLuhan, the great prophet of postmodern media, put it, quote, every truck stop cafe with a television and a newspaper became as cosmopolitan as New York or Paris, close quote. But then hypermodernity put an end to the shopping mall, which began to dissolve and disappear during the decades of the 2000s, as the internet, in turn, decentralized the mall by exporting it to the living room. In effect, the mall became the individualized rather than the communal experience. With the internet, the individual never had to leave his or her home to shop. And so during the 2000s, retail stores, shopping malls, and their connected media, bookstores, record stores, magazines, and newspapers began to disappear as they were absorbed into this new totally electronic world interior. Whereas the media of postmodernity had all been analog, records, cassette tapes, photographs, magazines, celluloid, the media of hypermodernity is exclusively digital. With the satellization of the exosphere, the analog telephone became transformed into the cell phone and later the smartphone, which jacked the individual into the world interior from wherever on the planet he or she happened to be located. One didn't have to go anywhere to be included in the new hypermodern world interior. All analog photographs could be dissolved from their nitrate surfaces and melted into cyberspace directly from the brain as the camera became an appendage of the new world interior. Vinyl records were dissolved and liquefied, and celluloid films transformed into bytes and obsolesced the movie projector. All analog media were liquefied, dissolved, and fed into the new matrix. Now the individual was empowered to become a new kind of entity, for hypermodernism has created the hyper-individual, a new and bizarre kind of individual that is nothing like the traditional Western idea of the transcendent self. For this new self is floating, discarnate, de-worlded, and decontextualized from all world horizons. The hyper-individual has no connection with history, community, or any kind of idealistic utopian projects. Those all characterize the past. The hyper-individual is a world unto himself. Hypermodernity pours liquid scorn upon all utopian projects, since such projects presuppose a historical narrative behind them. The hypermodern individual has no connection with the past or the future, indeed does not even have any connection with the preceding moment, for he or she exists in a timeless, spaceless, ahistorical, and modular present. The structure of time in hypermodernity is modular. It is composed of a succession of present moments, each of which is isolated and has no relationship to the preceding moment or any future moment. The ontology of the individual is that of an amoral hedonist achieving sensory gratification in each present moment, which is disconnected from all others. As a result, there are no values and there are no visions, and above all, no connection of the individual to any traditional social formations. He or she has become a nomad on his own, disconnected, modular, and historyless. Hence the advent of the dangerous loner, a new anthropological type of hypermodernity, which we will discuss later. Whereas the transcendental self of Western history was an objective entity who was actually embedded in a historical flow that connected him ultimately all the way back to the Greeks, the hypermodern individual has no connections to anything but the luminous glow of cyberspace. Now that he or she has become disconnected from all utopian projects and all sense of community, for there are no longer any world spaces for him to gather within as part of one or another social grouping, he or she can, within the world interior, gigantify him or herself to the level of an icon by using the new media that enable this process to take place. As I pointed out in my 2011 book, The New Media Invasion, Jeff Bezos is Amazon. Mark Zuckerberg is Facebook. Larry Page and Sergey Brin are Google. On Facebook, the hypermodern individual becomes a unique presence in cyberspace with his own website and his own YouTube videos. The technology now enables him or her to gigantify out of all proportion to any relation of scale that would connect him or her to any group or social formation whatsoever. Thus, the sobering truth now begins to dawn. Communism is dead. Critical theory is dead. The public intellectual is dead. For all these phenomena presuppose connections of the individual to larger social formations beyond himself as a modular unit isolated to sensual gratification in the present moment. The internet, with its satellized connections to the exosphere, unplugs and deworlds the individual, putting him into orbit about the planet. Hence, revolutionary protest groups such as the Weatherman Underground of the 1970s or the Baader Meinhardt terrorist group of the German Democratic Republic of the 1970s now give way to the phenomenon of the lonely, isolated spree killer who stands for nothing and represents no one. The spree killer, disconnected from all social formations whatsoever, wishes to leave a mark on the socius because he feels somehow disincluded from the larger projects of modernity. The irony is, however, that in actuality there is nothing that he is disincluded from, since hypermodernity has melted down all coherent social formations. The modular individual as world island unto himself is the only ontological self that exists in hypermodernity. A couple more here. Under the conditions of hypermodernity, there is no longer any art world per se, no longer any New York or Paris that functions as a cosmopolitan world center for the artist to be part of. Art now simply exists wherever there happens to be an artist, scattered at random across the striated landscapes of the global planetary surface, New York, Santa Fe, Flagstaff, Los Angeles, or he is a criminal who, like Banksy, must get into the city, make his mark, just like a spree killer, and get out quickly. Anselm Kiefer, with his isolated junk shop world horizon at La Rubiette, typifies this new ontological status of the artist as a loner who creates his art out of junked signifiers taken higgledy-piggledy from the blown-out civilizations of the past. Is there any longer even such a thing as the practice of art as an activity distinct from, say, science? The plasticine anatomical corpses of Gunther Hagens would seem to defy any clear separation of art from science. In these new vague ontologies, an artist like Anselm Kiefer begins to take on the ontological status of a junkyard dealer, Under the conditions of hypermodernity, there are no more art movements, only individual artists dotting the ontological clearing opened by this new and uncertain global world interior. Hypermodernity is the death of art, but not, perhaps, of the artist, who manages to eke out a living like the retrieval of some Robinson Crusoe figure washed ashore with a junk heap of broken signifiers from dead worlds surrounding him. J.G. Ballard's 1974 novel Concrete Island is a foreshadowing of the ontological status of the artist in hypermodernity. On the economic plane, hypermodernity is based upon the globalization of neoliberal capitalism becoming fused with the power and logic of computational technologies. Wall Street and Silicon Valley merge into a singular global power of abstraction, quantification, and subjugation. In a certain respect, one could almost make the incredible claim that all hypermodernity really is an entire world defined by the operation of globalized capitalism as such. The full return of capitalism's primitive energy, freed from all of the constraints and measures put in place throughout modernity, as it presents itself as the singular path for the destiny of the human race. But this logic of a pure neoliberal-styled capitalism that has been installed on the planetary scale is not simply applied to traditional spaces of economic productivity, such as the factory, perhaps the archetypal symbol of the industrial period of capitalism's development, but to virtually all of our public, political, cultural, and communicative territories, even our very biologies. In the era of hypermodernity, human life itself is recast as a business. Our very breath becomes a site of potential capitalist expansion and reproduction. What we encounter within this paradigm is both the idea and the social application that all of human life, whether it be interpersonal relationships, Facebook, Tinder, etc., human health, the mass privatization and corporatization across the field of public health, artistic expression, streaming music sites, and the rise of social media, quote-unquote, celebrities, politics, data as a political tool, the voter being ideologically recast as a consumer, etc., can be subject to the law of both capitalism and the new law of data extraction and aggregation. That is in many ways the simplicity of hypermodernity's economic logic. Quote, capitalism as life, life as capitalism, close quote. A couple more paragraphs here, guys, 2 more pages. A more nuanced analysis would assert that the economic horizon of hypermodernity is a bizarre combination of cybernetic game theory, a radicalized free market economics developed at the University of Chicago in the 1970s by the likes of Gary Becker and Milton Friedman, the neoliberal political logic initiated by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, and then perhaps the most important feature of hypermodern economics, the various computational technologies and processes that have been continually developed in Silicon Valley since the 1980s, that effectively allow the basic drive of capital to flow through the entirety of society on an interconnected global network. From the application of this logic, the entire global economy is set into orbit around abstract techno-financial forces and thus becomes de-worlded. All local economies, such as the farmer in rural Mexican village or the factory worker in Ohio, are simply wiped out and made progressively irrelevant by the abstraction and automation that now runs planetary capitalism in the 21st century. But it's not just local economies which are weakened here. The power and integrity of the nation state itself begins to decompose. The basic operation of transnational capitalism and hypermodernity demands that the regulatory and legalistic framework of the state becomes neutralized and made progressively impotent in constraining the endless circulation of both capital and data across borders. The result is often empowerment of local criminal organizations which rush to fill in the gap left behind by the state, such as the cartels in Mexico, groups like ISIS in the Middle East, and the various groups in Central Africa that control the incredibly lucrative mining operations. Thus, the economic transformation creates as a side effect its own internal proletariats and what the German theoretician Heiner Müllmann calls, quote-unquote, disruptive cultures as a result. Empowering the global ecumen means a disempowering of local community structures, generating violent counter-reactions in turn. Finally, in hypermodernity, there's no longer anything to achieve. Utopianism is dead. Revolutionary movements, despite the Arab Spring, are gone. Idealism is non-existent under such conditions, such as hypermodernity locks the individual into a modular present that is disconnected from all preceding presents. There is only the now. Anything that has occurred more than 48 hours ago simply ceases to exist. Civilization has now become the sum total of its population, a planet of individuals achieving instant gratification, amoral, valueless, unmotivated, and without vision. All exoskeletal spheres, to use Peter Sloterdijk's term, are gone, and now there is only social foam, that is to say, individuals rubbing up against other individuals, each with their own private semiotic sign regime clashing with each other's. Whereas in modernity, civilizations with their own sign regimes clashed with one another, in postmodernity, terrorist groups as social formations clashed. But in hypermodernity, each individual is a nation state unto himself, armed and equipped with his own electronic sign regime to do battle with other suits of light in cyberspace. With the annihilation of all geographic distance due to globalizing technologies, there is now nowhere for the individual to go to. The world interior of the civilization now exists on a glowing, self-luminous surface in front of him. There is, furthermore, nothing to achieve, since all utopian projects have come to an end with the liquidation of all social formation. In hypermodernity, too much is never enough, for it is a society of excess, surefit and signifier overload. Anyone can become quote-unquote famous for any reason, but under the conditions of constant electronic liquefaction, the fame will last precisely 48 hours. In a society in which everyone can become famous, no one in particular is famous. Thus, the structure and anthropological types of the previous world order of postmodernity are simply melted down under the impact of the unfolding architecture of planetary cyberspace. Hollywood stars, musical icons, and public intellectuals cannot exist under such conditions because the digital technologies of hypermodernity enable anyone to enter the civilizational clearing without the slightest effort. Hence, there is no discipline that is necessary to master, because all such conditions have been liquefied and melted down to be thrown out into the junk heap, along with all other civilizational paradigms. But there is an empire to build, and you must be careful in this new world interior what you do and say, for you, as a perpetual and continuous inhabitants of its inside, are constantly under surveillance. There's no place where you are not. The forum and the agora are everywhere. You do not need to go to them. They are already wherever you are. You are civilization now. That is the introduction, again, to hypermodernity and the end of the world. This was written early in 2020 or late 2019. Let me see here. I think it was late 2019. And I'd love to hear a kind of a follow-up since we've had this kind of medical, soft tyrannical application of measures and reflections from COVID-19. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Check this book out. There's a lot of good stuff in here. And thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.